the reason why this is such a big deal, right, is it's really going to focus on how do organizations, how do brands engage and get involved when there's a need for disaster relief, right? That sometimes could be a complicated question. But the timing of this session is coming again after a year where we've seen devastating wildfires, tornadoes that truly just rip through parts of the central part of our country. We saw floods. We saw even some of the terrible, terrible historic hurricanes, right? And so this has been kind of fresh on all of our minds as we continue to see how 1 year seemingly is outpacing the next year in terms of the devastation, the toll on lives, the toll on our economy, and certainly the real need for disaster relief. What is great is we have a true expert here that's going to talk about this, and I'm going to get into an introduction of our speaker here in just a moment. But one thing I do want to remind everyone is, one, if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat. Okay, we're going to end up making this extremely interactive. And then the other thing is, if you find something incredibly that you're passionate about and you think, hey, there's some people outside of this room that I think would benefit from this, go ahead and use your socials, post it out. We just ask that you use the hashtag COMMS, COMMS, for the number 4 change. And that way we can all kind of tie this all together. Does that make sense? Jen, any other housekeeping that I missed?
I think you've covered it all. As you can all see, we're recording the session and we'll be sharing it around after the fact. So just a heads up to turn off your cameras if you're not comfortable being featured.
Thank you very much. So today's speaker is Rosy McGillan. We know her as Rosy. She is the Chief Marketing and Communications Officer at American Red Cross. She joined the organization in 2020 and leads a team of more than 120 marketing and communications professionals. Rosy has had an incredible career, more than 25 years of focused on driving true social change, especially in the areas of public health. Prior to joining American Red Cross, she was the global purpose practice leader at Porter Novelli, where I had the great opportunity, as well as many people on this phone, of working with Rosy as a colleague and getting to know her as a friend. She has led several public health engagements with organizations like National Heart, Lung, Blood Institute, CDC, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, American Psychiatric Association, and so many more. She even had a stint at MSL Group, and even was a publicist at National Safe Kids campaign. So that was interesting, Rosy, to see as well. Please, if you wouldn't mind, let's all welcome our speaker today, Rosy McGillan. All right. Hey, I'm super excited about this, Rosy. I know, we've had a friendship and we've known each other for quite some time. And I've seen many of your friends looking back at us on this Zoom. But why don't you, if you don't mind, give us a brief overview. I think we all believe we know American Red Cross, right? Because it's been a part of our daily lives since far back as we can remember, maybe the first blood drive we've ever seen. But when I've talked to you in the past couple of years, everything you keep describing, I'm like, I didn't know American Red Cross did that too. Like, it just, the scale is just massive. So do you want to maybe start with giving us an overview, and then we'll dive into the topic?
Yeah, I'd love to, Brad. And I want to thank you for having me. I have to say, since I took the job, every day I learned something new about what we do at the Red Cross, which is good, right? It's good about a job. And as it turns out, actually, today is my 2-year anniversary at what I routinely say is the job of a lifetime. I have to say, really and truly, every single day, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to work here. I was in agency life for about 20 years, and returning to nonprofit was something I always knew I would do, and I just feel incredibly fortunate. And I think the thing that's really interesting as I sort of go through today's conversation is I was able to bring a lot of what I loved in the agency world with me. You know, we do a lot in the corporate partnership space. We do a lot of alliance work, a lot of community-based organization outreach. So that all that I loved, I just get to do more of. And I do want to just spend a minute sort of grounding everybody in the American Red Cross. You know, I think while we're going to talk about disasters specifically, and we're in the middle of our disaster season, I do think that we all sort of think we know about the Red Cross, but in fact, there's a lot more to it than a lot of us know. You know, we've been around 140 years, one of the best known brands in the world. But there's a lot to it that goes beyond blood and goes beyond disaster. So in short, what do? We prevent and alleviate human suffering when people are at their most vulnerable. And we do it through a massive volunteer network and essentially the generosity of the American public. We are the world's largest humanitarian network. The American Red Cross is one society of many, but our reach is actually quite significant. You know, when we think about the Red Cross, I think a lot of people think blood. I think they think disaster relief, but in fact, we collect 40% of the nation's blood supply. So that's why when you see a lot of messaging around out in the public from the news, from social media, we're in a blood crisis, we are truly in a crisis because so much of it is reliant on us being able to collect blood. When it comes to disasters, we actually respond to 60,000 of them a year. A lot of those actually are home fires. A lot of them are not things you're going to see on CBS Evening News or CNN. It's a lot of very localized disaster, but it all requires the same kind of thing: sheltering, feeding, mental health services, all of that. We have training services as well, which is where you think about things like your CPR training, if you were ever a lifeguard, if you ever got babysitting training, that's our training services arm. And then we also do international services and service to armed forces, which was really enlightening to me when I took this job. We do a lot in terms of making sure people in the military can communicate with family members. They might have to go home for a family emergency, the birth of a child. A lot of times we actually facilitate that. So the breadth of what we do is a lot broader than I think some folks know about. The other thing that's interesting, we are 90% volunteers. So we've got about 300,000 volunteers that make up our workforce. So the idea of generosity is more than I think a lot of us could imagine in terms of what gets us going and what allows us to stay at the level of sort of service delivery that we're at. And when I think about the reach, I would think, oh, you know, here's a big organization, we're sort of everywhere. But in fact, when you think about the breadth of that, on any given day, we help more than 20,000 people. That might be collecting blood and getting it to a hospital, or platelets for someone who's experiencing cancer. We're serving military members, as I talked about. We give out measles and rubella vaccines. We give people training that ultimately saves a life through, let's say, bystander CPR, whatever that might look like for a person. But from a disaster perspective, again, that 60,000 figure, keeping that in mind, on an average day, we help somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 to 200,000 families affected by a disaster in one single day. From a weather perspective, which I think tends to be the disaster mindset a lot of us have, we've got, you know, apps like everybody does, but our weather alerts, we've got about 1 million of those that go out every single day. And that ties into our focus on preparedness, right? Getting people ready before that disaster hits. And the other thing that we do that our brand is probably not necessarily affiliated with as closely or as publicly is mass casualty events, right? So Surfside building collapse, the very unfortunate mass shootings that we see, Uvalde being one recent example. We're providing support there as well. Again, it's sheltering, it's feeding of first responders, it's providing family reunification, it's giving spiritual or mental health support, depending on what the ask is. It's just something that we don't talk about as much, but it's a big part of what we do. And on the disaster side, you know, I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about it as it relates to the climate crisis. You know, because of the work that we do every day, we're seeing the impact, right? So while our focus may not be on, our public focus may not be on climate crisis avoidance, it's here. What are we going to do, right? So we are supporting families on a regular basis through, again, sheltering, feeding, blood supply after a disaster. And what we're seeing here is, I would say somewhere in the neighborhood, depending on what year you're looking at, about 40% of the Americans that we serve have lived in a county that's been struck by climate crisis or a climate disaster or weather-related disaster. And from a displacement perspective, which is a big focus for us, how do we get them housing? We've got about 8.5 million people who have been displaced as a result of a weather-related disaster. So that's a big area of focus for us. And as we sort of think about mission adaptation in this sort of new world of ours, we've compared the last 5 years versus 5 years before that, right? And the number of billion-dollar disasters, which translates into money that needs to be raised, that's doubled. Just to give you a sense of how it impacts our mission. We also look at it from the perspective of how frequently disasters are happening, so we can be thinking about how many volunteers do we need, how many resources do we need. And on average right now, we respond to a major disaster every 10 days. So that means those 300,000 volunteers, we've got to have them on the ground. Example of that, we're still in Florida for Ian. To some degree, we're still in Alaska from the tsunami there. We're still in Puerto Rico. So it's sort of back to back, which really does speak to our need to find volunteers. So as you can imagine, this reality that we're all in it stretches the capacity of the Red Cross. So that the timing of today's conversation, it couldn't be more timely. So I hope that background helps as we jump into some questions.
Rosy, that was great. And and let me just, again, one of the reasons why I think this conversation is going to be so important is whether you're in an organization today in an in-house communications role, or if you're maybe with one of the agency partners in nonprofit, when disasters come up, in particular, specifically when there's disaster and need for disaster relief, oftentimes we're hearing from employees, hey, what are we doing? What's our organization doing to get involved? And sometimes there's this feeling of not 100% knowing how to get involved, when to get involved, what can be meaningful. And we all, I think, on this session here, I think we're all very appreciative that we're no longer in thoughts and prayers, right? It's beyond that. It's like, what are we doing? How are we acting? How are we using our scale? And so I want to just kind of kick off with a couple things. You talked about the 60,000 disasters that you help, manage and provide some services to every year. I read somewhere on your website, it was like 1 every 8 minutes. I mean, it's mind-boggling, right? In terms of the scale. With all these volunteers and with the size and the scale, how does the organization wrap its arms around it and truly manage what could seem like, with 300,000 volunteers, a very not easy situation to make sure that you have everyone rowing in the same direction? Big picture, how do you coordinate all that? How does that happen?
It probably sounds a little cliche, but we're really good at it because we do it so often, Brad, and we're a well-oiled machine. We've got leadership at our disaster cycle services end of the business, which is the disaster operations. It's led by former FEMA and former Coast Guard leaders, right? So it is as sort of strict as a military operation could be, right? We have tons and tons of different policies and processes in place so that when you know a disaster is coming, you literally pull out the playbook. So from an operational perspective, all of that training, all of that experience helps us. But the other thing I would say again is it is the tremendous generosity that we get from our volunteers and from our donors, right? Because we are able to sustain the mission thanks to their giving of their time, giving of dollars, giving of, we say time, blood, money, right? Which might sound a little bit crass, but that is in fact it. We need your time to help be on the ground. We need your blood when there's going to be a crisis of blood supply, and we need your funding. That being said, we're constantly looking at, do we need to adapt our mission? So we do a lot of different things. From a volunteer perspective, we've started to modify our training and our volunteer requirements. It used to be, we would say, you've got to go deploy for 2 weeks. Well, increasingly, especially as we look at younger volunteers, they're not necessarily in a position to say, I'm going to give you 2 weeks, right? They want something to be a little bit more flexible. So we've got chunks of, say, 4-day commitments that we're looking, or 4-hour commitments that we're looking for. We've also made it a lot easier to train virtually or to even volunteer virtually. So for example, if we've got a disaster and part of what we do is, again, mental health support or connecting people with resources, we can do that virtually. So the flexibility of volunteerism is another thing that's helped us. Technology-wise, part of what we do is go out and assess damage to determine how many homes have been impacted and how can we financially support them. How can FEMA, as a partner, financially support them? Technology is a way that we do that, and coordinating our casework, all of that, trying to find ways for efficiency.
Rosy, it's staggering, and what a great way that you guys are pulling it all together. I've got one question here that's asking for just if we can repeat some of those key stats. Specifically, I'm guessing it's the 60,000 disasters covered in a year. I want to say Ivalice, but I may be completely horrible at that. Did I get that right?
Yeah, 60,000 disasters on average a year. And the other statistic that I had mentioned was we collect 40% of the nation's blood supply.
Yeah, excellent. Rosy, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
No worries. There was one that was like every 8 minutes or something like that.
Yeah, I think that was in your question, Brad, actually, to me.
Yeah, it was interesting. Up on the website, it was saying that once every 8 minutes, the Red Cross is engaged in providing relief and help. And again, it may, Rosy, be like some of these individual home fires or something where it might not be on a massive scale, but that's a lot of coordination and effort to really provide the services of American Red Cross.
Yeah, and when you think about it from a communications perspective, so we've got, I'm part of, I oversee our national headquarters communications team, but we've also got communicators at the local level, and they are absolutely doing a lot of this work. They're the ones talking to media. They are the ones who are making sure that resources are connected to the families who need them. So it's very much a sort of labor love across the country versus just feeling like all of this is housed under me. Without those local communicators, we wouldn't be able to do what we do for those 60,000 disasters. Got
it. One of the things I'd like to just follow up on, just because I'm like, it's pure curiosity, and we'll get really back on track here. But you mentioned experts from FEMA, experts from the U.S. Coast Guard and things. What other major experts or specialists, like, do you have meteorologists on staff? Would there be specialists that we would be completely surprised to hear that American Red Cross employs?
Yeah, we have meteorologists on staff. We also obviously have a deep analytics bench to analyze all of the different efficiencies that we're trying to find. We have a chief medical officer. We have an entire public health team that works on the biomed side of the business. We've got a chief nursing officer. We've got a slew of sometimes retired registered nurses, in fact, who are helping to cover the gap down in Florida right now because of the shortage of nursing. But the chief nursing officer was quite a surprise to me. We've got a chief innovation officer who helps us specifically around finding the efficiencies when it comes to technology, especially in the biomed side of the blood side of our business.
Rosy, you've talked about how the American Red Cross comes in and deploys and brings volunteers. I'm curious, in terms of, as head of marketing communications, what is your team's main role during a disaster, let's say?
The simple answer would be, from a marketing and communications perspective, it's about amplifying our brand and then leveraging it in ways that are going to get resources to people. But quite honestly, it's about, let me start with the comm side of things. It's about maintaining the trust of the American public so that we can deliver our services, right? We're trying to get information to people in a time of disaster so that they know where to go, what kind of help they can get, whether it's through us or through another partner. And in some cases, it's what to do in advance of a disaster. And in this case, disaster, I would include blood crises under there. So it's some of the traditional things you would think about. It's deploying spokespeople, it's developing the messaging, the content development, but it's also about, and Brad, we were talking about this a little bit before we started, we talk a lot about statistics and we talk about impact as you think about organizations that want to support a cause or employees that want their company to support a cause. We use media to tell that impact story in real time. So we're constantly working with our disaster team to make sure that we've got daily statistics. We update our talking points twice a day when you're in the heat of a disaster so that we can be demonstrating what the impact is, because our donors want to know, media wants to know. But I'll give you a quick example. So during Ian, Twitter came to us and they said, we'll give you a free Twitter timeline takeover for 24-hour period. Twitter had never done that with us before. So we said, okay, let's give it a shot. 8 hours in, and so just to go back, this means anybody that logs onto Twitter over this 24-hour period would be fed basically an ad, if you will, asking for donations for Ian, people suffering from Ian, and where they could go to redcross.org to make a donation. 8 hours in, it was Saturday, I remember this starting, and 8 o'clock Sunday morning, my social media person's on the phone with me, and she said we had 10 million impressions in that 8 hour period. And a lot of it was negative. We get a lot of bot traffic that isn't always helpful. But the challenge there was it was impeding our ability to get, because we go through all of that engagement to see if people need help. Are they stranded in Pine Island in Southern Florida and they don't know where the shelter is? And so we had to make a really tough decision where we said, okay, our primary job as communicators is to get information to you. We had to turn off comments because we literally couldn't get to the people who needed us. And we have a commitment to make sure that there's a very quick turnaround time with our social care. So it's a big part of our job. And again, it goes back to, are we maintaining the trust of the American public? Are we protecting the reputation of the brand so that people get what they need? On a marketing side, we develop a disaster PSA that we get out there. Celebrities came to us specifically at Ian as one example and said, I want to donate. How do I donate? So we coordinate with the agency side of that team, work with our development team to say, okay, X celebrity wants to give money. How do we facilitate that? And in other cases, it's getting creative assets out to our field so that they can be promoting whatever need they may have in their community. So it really does run the gamut. It's sort of things you would traditionally do in marketing and communications. We're simply doing it with the goal to inform and connect people with resources.
I have to tell you, every answer wants me to ask 3 different follow-ups based on that answer. Just a quick one on that, though. What I find very impressive, because I just cannot remember a period or time where you've had kind of a compromise or a breach. You have celebrities and big people coming to you for big donations and stuff. There's no leaks though, right? You guys, like, it seems like the amount of integrity that you all have in terms of when to communicate, how to communicate, who to communicate, you guys take very seriously. How have you protected against that? There's a lot of people involved.
Yeah, you know what I would say, Brad, is in terms of the integrity piece, you know, on the celebrity side, it's just absolutely understood, and we reiterate it day in and day out that you have to keep the confidentiality there or you won't get the support that you need. But from a communications and a media perspective, we actually use the term, sounds a little fluky given our business, but it's flooding the zone. So, you know, on average, we get about 500,000 media mentions in any given year. And the majority of that is positive, proactive outreach so that we're always telling the story about what we do. So when you get into a crisis, the media are going to be more inclined to give us the benefit of the doubt, right? So we look at our sentiment every single month, and it's one of the first things we look at. And our media sentiment is, from a traditional media perspective, 99 to 100% positive or neutral. Social media, it's a little bit lower. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of 85 to 86. But it is, a lot of that is, you know, working with fact checkers, you know, just pushing out positive stories so that they see what the impact is of the work that we do, and they're going to be less inclined, you know, to compromise our integrity. We have to have it, or we're not going to be able to serve the mission.
Yeah, that's great. Listen, we've got a great question, Annalise. I'm gonna turn to you. Why don't you go ahead and ask your question directly?
Thank you. Wonderful. I wanted to, as you were speaking about when a crisis is unfolding and your primary goal is to reach those in need, say people don't know where a shelter is or they need direct support, but you also have the dual objective of trying to encourage people to donate and to maybe to get attention for this disaster, whether it's through funding or donations. And I wanted to know if you could give some examples of how you separate those two objectives that are almost happening at the same time and maybe on the same channels, and how you do that effectively.
Sure. You know, we're very direct about it. Just about any messaging that we get out, especially at the beginning of a disaster, is it ends with, if you are looking for a way to help, redcross.org, 1-800-RED-CROSS, or see if your community needs blood. It's part of every single message that we get out there. So, you know, we sort of look at it from the perspective of the consumers of the messages that we're getting out there, maybe those in need, but they're also going to be those who are trying to help those in need. So we look at it as if that's all part of the same audience. We have to get that message out there over and over again.
That's great. That's great. You know, why don't we bridge a little bit here, Rosy, to how have you seen organizations, or how can organizations get involved? Let's say they haven't yet done a blood drive with you, or maybe they haven't been involved with disaster relief, but maybe they're thinking about it, or maybe they're getting pushed by their employees or other stakeholders to really use their scale to get involved. What's a good starting point, or how would you recommend to an organization to start to try to get involved with American Red Cross?
You know, the good thing is, Brad, we work with just about any size organization, and we make it as easy as we can. Now, I'm biased in saying that we make it easy, so that's not me on the other end of it, but we do give a variety of different ways that people can support. So, you know, my first bit of advice would be to consider what the need is, be aware of what's happening with the particular disaster, and where can you've heard me say this before, authentically engage, make a difference versus just promote that you've contributed, right? So perfect example I would give is PetSmart charities. So they were keenly aware of the fact that somewhere in the neighborhood of 90%, I would say, 90, 92%, something like that, of pet owners say, you know what, my pet is a member of my family. At the same time, they were also keenly aware of the fact that people won't go to a shelter if they can't bring their pet, or they will hunker down and they won't think about evacuating before an event if it in any way compromises their ability to be with their pet. So in this case, they reached out to us, and it was a significant financial donation. It's a bigger brand, but they did it in a way that directly aligned with their business objectives and in a way that met the need of what can be a really challenging sort of a quandary for us when we're providing sheltering support, right? So that partnership is one that's turned into not just financial, but also guidance, right? They've given us ways to think about how do we accommodate pets? How can we do it in a safe way? How can we have veterinarian support when we need it, right? They were very in tune to what about them was a good offer for us, and at the same time, something that they knew the people we served needed. That being said, there are a lot of smaller organizations that, and I should say PetSmart Charities, we hadn't worked with them before, but smaller organizations might want to start with their local Red Cross, right? They might want to think about what is it that this particular organization needs versus feeling like it has to be something that's done at a big, huge national level. Think about what it is you're hearing from your employees. If they want to be giving dollars, it doesn't have to be a huge amount. It can be a matter of, okay, I might offer an employee match. Red Cross, how do I do that? And we can do it pretty easily for you. You know, we set up a website or a microsite that's branded by that organization. We facilitate the ability for you to get employee dollars matched. And we do the heavy lifting for you in terms of sort of the interface. And I think the other thing I would say is, you know, I can reach out to me. I can figure out the best way to connect you to whoever it is based on what the ask is or based on what the interest area is. You know, the thing I would add to this, and I'm probably giving you more than you want on this question, but one of the reasons that I'm at the Red Cross is because of the leadership here and the ability to think as a business, right? There are a lot of nonprofits that are very focused on the mission, as are we, no question, but they're more inclined to say, I'm going to rely on government dollars, or I'm going to rely on the goodness of the American public, versus how do I think about what corporations need and want. And that's very much part of our objective when we're thinking about our fundraising strategy. And that to me helps give a lot of different openings regardless of the organization's size or their interest. Hopefully that answers your question.
It does. Well, thank you very much on that. And I'm going to turn to Whitney Daly just for a second. I'm going to go up to Tessa here. Whitney, who has, you know, not only a part of Impact Relations is at Allison and Partners, has done a lot of research in this space. And I think you're making a good point, Whitney. So I'm going to bring you into the conversation. Would you just restate for the whole group here?
Yeah, for sure. Hi, everybody. I put in the chat, you know, I've conducted research on employee engagement and how employees want to give and when. And what we have seen is that employees are most likely to give in real time during a specific moment or need or disaster moment. And if that money can go, especially to impact their colleagues that might be affected, then they're even more likely to give. So that was just something I wanted to throw out. And Rosie, you were kind of talking about that in terms of, you know, making localized donations to specific Red Cross chapters that might need that support in that moment. But really appreciating your insights in your conversation, Rosie. So thank you for your work. It's very impactful.
Well, thanks, Whitney. It's nice to see you.
You too.
And Tessa, I'd like to go turn to you. I think you have a great question. Would you like to ask it directly to Rosie right now?
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity, and hi everyone. And thank you, Rosie, for a great session so far. I'm thinking about communications during a disaster and how the Red Cross might provide assistance for or reach diverse communities. So anyone from maybe someone who speaks another language other than English as their primary language, or people who have, you know, fall all across the spectrum in terms of citizenship status. what does the Red Cross do to ensure that those people are cared for and in a culturally meaningful way that also provides their safety and their identities in mind?
Yeah, thanks, Tessa, for the question. And it's particularly relevant when we think about regions of the country that are repeatedly impacted by disaster. Puerto Rico with Hurricane Fiona, Hurricane Ian, Hurricane Nicole. And there are a couple of different ways I would answer the question. Number one is we try to get as many Spanish speaking, as one example, volunteers as possible to help us as communicators to be on site at shelters so that they can help facilitate what can be a challenging situation from a language perspective, but also, again, when a person is at their most vulnerable. So having facilitated conversation with native speakers is a huge priority for us. As an example, in Ian, we actually had, in addition to the bilingual communicators that we had, we brought in folks from the Mexican Red Cross. They deployed, I want to say 14, 15 volunteers to help us with that very specific need. And then a lot of it is partners, right? We're National Council of La Raza, who just changed its name, and its name is escaping me at the moment, but LULAC is another partner of ours. NAACP is one that we've been working really closely with, specifically around Ian, because we're pretty broadly spread, I guess is the best way I would put it, but no one organization can do all of this, and we constantly have to rely on our partners just as they rely on us. So we look at ways that we can, sort of stay within our swim lanes and recognize what we can and we can't do. So the partnership piece is sort of core to everything that we do. And then the other thing we do also is just making sure that to whatever degree we can, we are continue to diversifying our workforce. And from a citizenship perspective, what I will say is at shelters, we don't ask about that. Anyone is welcome who needs the sheltering.
Oh, excellent. Does that answer it, Tessa? Yeah, good. Thank you. Rosy, I'm curious, we talk a little bit about best practices for organizations getting engaged. And also, are there things that you'd suggest to avoid? You said it in your last answer, when we started this about how organizations can really get involved, and it was authenticity was in there, right? And you made that clear. But I'm curious, what are some of the pitfalls when you see, and I'm not looking for a company example by name, but when does it not go well? Or, are there things to avoid if you're just getting into this?
Yeah, I would say, in terms of what is less helpful for the American Red Cross, again, sort of thinking about what our mission delivery objectives are, a lot of times we'll hear from partners.
Rosy, let me jump in right here. If you happen to be off mute, just if you don't mind checking, we got a little bit of background noise there. Go ahead, Rosy. Thank you.
One of the things that we often see from corporate partners is they want to send employees to serve as volunteer responders. And a lot of times employees want that, right? They want that direct, immediate impact. And while that is a tremendous offer, and it's something that is increasingly something that we hear, something that we see, it's really hard for us to suddenly have spontaneous volunteers who are ready to go out and deploy. Part of it is the training that's required. Part of it is the disaster volunteer workforce that we have is pretty meticulously planned out in advance. Alternatively, going back to Whitney, to your comment, what we would say in those cases is if you've got employees in an affected region of the country, start to think about how they can become engaged in a bit of a smaller way. The other thing I would say is think about what the disaster is and any sensitivities around that, right? You don't want to be out promoting what it is you're doing at a time when the focus needs to be on getting the resources to people. The time can come, certainly, to promote that, but think more about what it is you can be doing and maybe telling that story 24 hours later versus what's the story I can get out and tell immediately. You know, there's some sensitivity to timing there. And then the last thing I would say is we get a lot of questions about clothing donations or household items, even home cooked meals, right? All incredibly heartfelt, completely understand that. We don't actually take donations of items. Financial donations for us are much more effective. We can use those immediately to help people who have been directly impacted. It also takes a lot of time, it takes money, it takes space to figure out what to do with those items, distributing them, storing them. Other partners that can be doing that, but it's just not something where we're going to be as effective, and it's not the best use of our resources. And that's when we get a lot of questions about, and sometimes surprise about, when we say thank you, but we actually can't take that.
Rosy, staying on this topic of engagement, there's usually kind of, it would seem to me, a wave of passion and interest, you know, around a disaster in the immediate term, right? Either right before or right after. We're seeing, you know, the reports, we're seeing the devastation like in Ian or you know, some of these wildfires and things like that. But you're there, as you said, you're still in Florida supporting Ian and will be, you know, for months to come. Is it appreciated if you could get partners that are comfortable, not just in the beginning, but kind of longer term? And how does that work? And can you flight some of this? Or
yeah, you know, I would say the best advice there for anybody who's thinking about when do I come in and support a disaster is don't feel like it always has to be in the heat of the moment. You know, there's another sort of category that we're always looking for help in, and that's where it's needed most, right? It doesn't always have to be that you give support in that moment. Think about year round, right? Think about non-disaster season, and can you be supporting the Red Cross so that we then deploy the funds, or we deploy the support, or whatever, in whatever form where it's needed most. You know, another example would be even though we had a national blood crisis, we're on appeal 3 or 4 times a year, especially as we go into holidays. Summertime is another time. Think about whether or not you can sponsor blood drives at your location, or give your employee time off to donate blood. You know, it doesn't have to be in the moment. It's very much a year-round organization. They're year-round disasters. And we do see drop-offs specific to disasters pretty much 2 to 3 weeks in. So the year-long perspective helps us tremendously.
Got it. For everyone attending, please don't hesitate to put additional questions into the chat. We'll get to them. We've got a few minutes left here for sure. Rosy, I want to talk about your team for a second, and any of your, you know, great partner organizations that have teams. It would seem that when you're volunteering, or if you're seeing the disasters over and over again, there could be, you know, how do you keep the mental well-being of your team, you know, when they're dealing with such tragedy on a fairly consistent basis?
Yeah, we certainly struggle with it, Brad. In fact, we just had our quarterly town hall with our CEO last week, and she always gets the question, what keeps her up at night? And what keeps her up at night is the emotional and the physical fatigue, as well as the you know, the burnout. And that's specific to volunteers in particular, who again are deployed for multiple weeks at a time in many cases. On the marketing and communications side of things, social care, our social care team is an area that's of great concern to me, because again, we're on 24/7 to make sure that we're keeping an eye on all of our social channels. And we look for people who understand the nature of the mission when we're hiring, but B, we've just got a lot of tremendous collaboration and support. You know, we've got a media line that different people staff different days of the week or different weekends out of the month, so that we're spreading the spreading the love around, if you will. But it's very much a real concern for us. And we're a shared service across the organization. So every single line of service is tapping into marketing communications. So even if it's not a disaster, we are making sure that just like an agency, whoever our quote unquote client is feels like they are the most important client. So it's a lot of communication to make sure that we're covered, and a lot of patience among what I would consider just fantastic team of people who are really, really mission driven. And that's why they're here. The tenure here is another thing that really surprised me. I've got people here who've been here 15, 20 years. I mean, this is a lifelong commitment for a lot of people who are here because they just believe in the mission so much.
Rosie, quick follow-up, and then we've got another question coming in. The quick follow-up is disasters happen all the time, weekends, after hours. Do you have to have a setup with a team that has an on-call unit, or do you guys have 3 different shifts or 2 different shifts? How does that work?
Yeah, it's not to that degree, Brad. We've got an on-call system that we just make sure somebody's point, especially from a media perspective, from a field communications perspective. But with the exception of a few different types of disasters, we've usually got a little bit of time that we can anticipate. We look at the weather. We have newsroom every single day where we get together on the phone at 9:30 or 10 o'clock actually. And we go through, here's what's on the list for today. Here's what we're anticipating from a government relations perspective, or from a weather perspective, or from a social media perspective. So we are in constant communication. We try and predict wherever we can. And if not, we tap into our on-call system.
Got it. And we've got time for just 1 or 2. And so I want to turn to Sarah first. Sarah Cunningham, would you jump in and ask your question to Rosie?
Hi there, Rosie. And apologies, I contributed to background noise a moment ago.
Okay.
I was just wondering, so Tessa asked about supporting diverse communities in appropriate ways, and I was wondering if there's a method you use to stay up to date with the best language to use when it comes to communicating to and about vulnerable audiences. I'm thinking about folks experiencing homelessness, those suffering from drug addiction, et cetera, and how you might balance terms that folks are primarily familiar with and use every day with what is most appropriate.
I can tell you it's not just me, that's for darn sure. But we have a variety of different ways that we stay ahead of it as best we can. And one of those is we've got a lot of employee resource groups. So we've got our Emoja group, for instance. We've got our Latino resource group. We've got a Pride group, which I'm actually the executive sponsor of, that are sort of helping to inform us, right? They're identifying a lot of the trends. And we were just having this conversation with our Latino resource group last week, actually. And that's one way. So, right, listening in, tapping into our team member resource groups. The other is our diversity, equity, and inclusion team. We've got a full team that's dedicated not only to how we function as an organization, but also what our strategies ought to be. Again, the partner organizations that I talked about. We've got a National Diversity Advisory Council, NDAC, that's got a lot of those member groups that I had mentioned that we learn from, and volunteers. Our volunteers are an incredible resource to us. So I think it's a combination of all of that, right? And it not always just being about communications. In certain ways, we're the ones that get that guidance versus being the ones that direct all of that. And then we do have multicultural communications as part of our comms team, but it's a work in progress for sure.
Very good. We probably have time for one more question, maybe 2, but probably 1. And for this, I want to go back to Annalise, who I'm nominating as an honorary moderator for this session. This is a great question. Go ahead, Annalise.
Because I don't want to too much of the time, but and I know my internet is a bit unstable. Can you hear me? It's okay. All right. What is the most important thing when you would say communicating with passion during a design thing to keep in mind when either from an internal Red Cross perspective or like what you recommend to external corporations?
I think you went in and out, but I think you were
Situation that
asking
is
about,
already quite tense.
yeah, most important to remember in terms of making sure we're communicating with compassion, I think was the gist of it. Annalise, was that right? You know, I think some of it is around just being aware of what the situation is, right? And being informed about what the situation is. But I think the bigger piece is reminding ourselves that, and this is from a Red Cross perspective for a moment, we are not the story here, right? We're constantly making sure, and we're asking ourselves, are we navel gazing a little bit too much here? Are we talking too much about the Red Cross? It is about the people that we serve, and it's about the service delivery that we are focused on first and foremost. So I think that helps in terms of the lens through which we look at how we're going to communicate. From a corporate perspective or from a industry partner perspective, I would go back to the earlier discussion around making sure that you're in it for a reason that is authentic to you as a brand, right? Whether it's aligning with your business practices and how those align with the Red Cross values, but just really thinking through, excuse me, what you want to make sure that you're getting out of it. If it's just for promotion, if it's just to say, hey, here's this great thing we're doing, I don't think it's going to be. I think there's some risk there. Would probably be a better way to say it.
Hey, Rosie, before I move to a close, which you've seen before, which can take 20-30 minutes. I'm just kidding. But any final thoughts that you'd like to impart on this group?
You know, I would say there is room for everybody, right? There is room for every organization to think about how they can get involved in disaster relief. You got to get creative sometimes, and it isn't always the biggest brand that's out there. It's about thinking again about what is it your employees are looking for from you, and thinking about how you align with Red Cross or whatever any other organization is that you'd be looking at. But there's room for all of us, I think, to make a important, impactful difference for sure.
I hope all of you understand why we were so excited to get Rosie, get her time today and talk about this, right? I mean, I think we would all love it if there were not going to be another need, right? But that's just not practical. There will unfortunately be more wildfires and tornadoes and floods and disasters, home fires, unfortunately mass shooting. Like, we're in this, some of it climate driven, but we're in this moment where there's going to be a continual need. And what I really appreciate, and thank you so much, Rosie, is that you've taken this extremely large scale organization that we all seemingly know but don't necessarily know, and you brought it down to us in terms of how we can all get engaged. And I think with some very practical steps. I loved that you gave the highlight of PetSmart Charities, because it was so authentic. It connected so much to their business goals and objectives and their brand, while at the same time providing that compassion, understanding that there's a real need in terms of shelter with pets and that type of thing. Like, those are great. And the other one of the big key takeaways I took for everyone on this call, I hope you took multiple things, but there's multiple ways to get involved.
Yeah.
One of which Rosie said you can reach out to her. So Rosie, I'm going to put you on the spot. Email address?
Yes, you can share my email address. It's rosemary.mcgillan@redcross.org.
Okay, so we promise not to inundate you, but I think this is really important, because one of the things you may have heard is as simple as getting a microsite up and running so that your internal teams can start raising money or really donating and doing matches. Like, a lot of this stuff happens in short amounts of time, like in hours or in half days. And And I think the other thing let's not overlook is start local as well. If you don't know how you want to get involved, start local. Really look at those moments where your brand can step up, your organization can really help. And let's face it, our employees are going to like that. Our stakeholders are going to like to see how we get engaged authentically in these moments. So I really thank you, Rosy, for this wonderful conversation. I appreciate everyone's time. Mark your calendars. We're going to have another one of these before the end of the year. And that is going to be on December 14th. I believe it is at noon Eastern. Okay. We'll make sure that all this information gets out. And it's going to be about building out decision frameworks for when a brand should consider taking a stand or when they should pass. And we've got an incredible speaker already lined up. It is Linda Rutherford, who's the Chief Communications Officer at Southwest Airlines. And we'll probably have one or two other guests as well that have really put these practices in place. Again, our goal here is to always share, coming together as a community like we did here today. Multiple people had great questions for Rosy. That's the part of the community that's important. We all have something to teach each other and to learn from each other as well. So with that, unless Jenna, if you're going to tell me that there's other things that I need to say.
You've got it all. Thanks, Brad.
All right.
So,
then with
thanks
that,
everyone for joining.
everyone
Thank
has
you,
a great
Rosy.
rest of your day and week. Thank you, Rosy. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.